switched headphones. This is one of those things where I don't need the headphones now, but once my toddler gets home from daycare and hears me talking to you all, she'll be like, "Ooh, what's happening?" And we'll have a little bit of a interruption, which might happen anyways, frankly, but well, hopefully not.
Totally fine.
Oh, and I don't know who asked the question about getting things submitted earlier. It's totally fine. Just bring whatever you have, well,
That
virtually into the breakout room and you're good.
Okay.
So as long as you have it for when we talk, that's all good.
All right, no problem.
I told Max earlier, I was like, don't worry, spontaneous feedback and quick review is just part of my life. So it's totally fine.
Great.
I think, I'm just looking, we can probably start. We're missing a couple, not too many though, like 2 or 3 people. Yeah, I think we can get started. So welcome to Tuesday. Feels like Thursday. So we have a guest for class tonight, not necessarily guest speaker, a guest kind of like instructor. This is Christy Presler. She is a design technologist, a senior design technologist, I believe, at Upstate Interactive. And she was also, for a brief period of time, an instructor in cohort 1 with me, which was cut short by the birth of her daughter. So that was always fun. But she is an amazing resource in terms of design, UX and UI, and she knows many, many things about all the things that you guys have been learning. And so I think that she's gonna be a really good help tonight. And so I'm just gonna let Christy take it away whenever she's ready. And whenever she's done, we'll have time for questions, and then we'll do the breakout sessions with Christy on one-on-ones.
Yeah, thank you for the intro. Yeah, I realized I've done like at least a tiny bit of teaching with every cohort of Careers in Code, but this is the first time I'm teaching Careers in Code not pregnant. So this is a totally different scenario. I actually have energy right now. That has never happened previously. But yeah, so short, I'm going to try to keep this brief because I apologize for the amount of information I'm about to drop on you all tonight, because the slide deck we're going to go through is the one I taught last year. I'm pretty sure in 2 full classes. So, and I want to make sure we have plenty of time to go back through like doing one-on-one portfolio review with where you guys are at and what you're thinking you're going to do for the rest of the project. So if at any point you're like, can you slow down the talking like a tiny bit, I will try. But I also linked to all the resources we're going to go through tonight so that if you're kind of like, what just happened and you want to go back through and look at them, that's also totally fine. So short version, who am I? Why are we talking? All of those fun things. So I actually studied art and design in college. And when I graduated, knew I didn't want to be an artist, but wasn't really sure exactly what I wanted to do. After taking a job that was just something to pay the bills, really needed to switch careers, started digging into web design because I was like, well, I like to design things. There's lots of jobs for web design. Maybe I can do that. Realized pretty quickly that in order to design things for the web, you have to understand how it works. Started learning how to code, like started with HTML, CSS, all that stuff. Learned JavaScript, got kind of swamped by it, learned PHP, which somehow made JavaScript easier. And then I basically started learning, was like, this development stuff is awesome. It's so fun. It's super challenging, but it's also just like really exciting because there's new things to learn all the time, and like things are constantly changing, and this is just like so interesting to me. So and basically that was 7.5, 8 years ago, and I just haven't looked back. So I spent about I learned to be a dev right before boot camps were a thing. I like missed that train by about 8 months. But after about 6 to 8 months of like independent study, ended up getting my first dev job in 2014, and I've been working in the industry ever since. So I've been, because of my sort of weird skill set of like, I'm both a developer and a designer, I've done both roles. So I've done for like front end development, I've done full stack development, I've done user experience design, and then most recently I'm a design technologist, which is my favorite role because it really mixes both design and development together. All right, that was supposed to be short. That wasn't short. Apologies. All right. You'll notice that Max and I have in common, we both talk a lot. Just a second here. Let me share my screen. Make sure we have the right one. All right. Is everyone looking at something that says Visual Design Basics?
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. All right. So we're gonna start with running through visual design stuff, and then we're going to talk really briefly about portfolio stuff. Because the other part I didn't mention is it was really funny. Max reached out to me a few weeks ago, and I said, yeah, actually, I'm super swamped the next couple of weeks because I'm rebuilding my portfolio. So I actually just went through the process. Well, sort of in the process you guys are doing right now. So I guess the one thing I can say about portfolio projects is try not to stress about them, because you're going to rebuild them again in a minute, or a year, or however long. The portfolios don't last, I guess is the best way to say. So build something that you feel like works for you now, and then don't stress about it, because I can almost guarantee that by the end of the class, I don't mean like today, but I mean like the whole Careers and Code class, like you're going to look back at your portfolio and go, what? I have to rebuild that whole thing because that doesn't even represent what I know now. That's just the way upskilling in this industry is. You just look back for things you wrote a few months ago and you're just like, what was I thinking? What? I'm missing all these things. All right. So visual design basics, we're going to run through really, really quickly. A lot of the basics, like principles behind what makes visual designs tick. All right. So what we're covering is, like, first of all, what is design and who uses design? What principles make up visual design? We're going to talk about color and typography, responsive page layout, and then we're going to talk about design systems and styling frameworks. One other quick note, even if you're like, I couldn't design my way out of a box, like I have no aesthetic understanding whatsoever, that's totally fine. It's still important to know this stuff exists, because most likely, even if you go into backend development, at some point you're going to be working with a designer. So it's good to know. It's good to know what language they're using, and be able to communicate and understand a little bit about what they do, because that's a common problem in tech, is figuring out how to get designers and developers to talk to each other effectively. So what is design and who uses it? All right, so design is basically looking at the functionality of a product, software, application. So we're particularly talking about software and things like that. There's the idea of form over function. So basically you're trying to solve a problem, and you're creating something that does that. So design can be visual, but it doesn't have to be. So design can be something like figuring out how a user is going to move through a problem. So how is somebody actually going to buy something on a website, as an example of a design? Isn't necessarily visual. That might actually just be a step-by-step, like, here's what happens in the process. So design thinking is first of all, nonlinear. It's not like, okay, we're at point A and we want to get to point B and we know exactly what's going to happen to get there, to get us there the best way possible. Generally what happens is you end up going through a bunch of ideas, trying out a whole bunch of them, and then you figure out what the best solution is that's available. And then a lot of times you end up changing it again later because iteration, you find the best solution, you do the best with what you have now, but sometimes things change. All right, so the first part of design thinking is figuring out who you're building for. This is super important because you have to understand who is going to use the project, like use the product. It's very common to think, oh, I know how to use it. Like I built it. Like this is how it's supposed to be used. If you put it in front of an actual like an actual person whom is your customer or your user or whoever's going to be interacting with it, it never ceases to humble me that whenever I do that with a product I've built, they're like, they find ways to break it or ways to try to do things that never occurred to me and that I didn't solve for. So that's just, it's really important to understand who you're designing for in order to solve the problem in a way that works for them, right? So just as an example, if you're trying to design an interface, it matters a lot if your primary user base is blind, for example, right? So you're trying to design an interface that they can use effectively using a screen reader, makes a big difference. Or if they're colorblind, that matters too. Not just visual things, like if they're hearing impaired and you need to be able to use like sound related to your application, there's lots of examples. Yeah, so this you are not your user is actually, I have like a sticker posted on my wall that says you are not my user. You're not your user because it's you have to remember it's easy to design for things that you like. It's harder to design for other people, and designing for other people is really what we're trying to do the vast majority of the time. So how do we solve problems? So we start with what is the problem? Who are we solving it for? Then we shift into how are we going to actually solve that problem? The way that we do that is we figure out, first of all, what data do we need to actually solve that problem? What ways can we solve that problem? And of those ways that we've thought of, how many of those can we actually build? This will be something that no matter what type of development you end up in, figuring out can you build something is a big thing that will just come up over and over again. And the short answer is often, I'm not sure, let me check. Because oftentimes it's like the solid answer is maybe question mark, because you're sort of like, yeah, I think we can do that, but I need to verify that, like, you know, such and such things are not causing problems. Software, well, actually engineers in general are notorious for answering questions that way, but the reality is there's just a lot of factors involved, and sometimes you just have to check. So just a good thing to keep in mind. Another part of this process from the design side is something called wireframing, which I think you guys have already dealt with. Sometimes you create functional prototypes that don't like have full functionality, but do specific small things so you can get them in front of users for people to check them out. And then another big, often overlooked part of this is figuring out, like I said, what data do you need and what does that data need to look like? I don't think you all have gotten deep into data stuff yet, but data plays a big part of, even all the way from the interface layer of what you see. Data plays a big part in the whole process, because if you don't have the information, you can't display it to someone. So yeah. All right, and then the last piece, this is the step that developers love to hate, which is testing. So testing is one of those things, like, you spend all this time making this thing perfect, right? And then you hand it off to someone else, or you get to challenge yourself. Someone who's going to try and break it. Basically, that's what testing is, right? Is figuring out if there's some way that you didn't think of that somebody's going to break it. It's important to figure out if it can break that way, because your users might do that, and it's just part of life. But it's hard because it's facing into, I was talking to our QA recently and talking about how QA is hard. So this phase is often called quality assurance. So testing is often one of those things where devs love to hate it, because you have to you have to take a step back and look at all the things you might have done wrong, which is just as much fun at work as it is in your personal life. So it can be an emotionally difficult process, but it's a good habit to get into. Taking a step back, emotionally separating from all the stuff that you just put all kinds of blood, sweat, and tears into, and then taking a hard look at making sure it actually works. Be a dev who tests stuff. It will set you apart from all the devs who are just like, I don't want to do it. It's probably okay. We'll ship it. Just trust me on that one. All right. So visual design, as I talked about, design is not necessarily visual, but there is a whole portion of visual design. So that's the part of design that utilizes images, pictures, typography, which is basically words and how they look, space. So how things are laid out, how they have space between them or connect to each other, layout, so where things go on the page, and color. So improving both how people use stuff and how they look, like aesthetics and things like that. I put aesthetics last year on purpose because frankly, aesthetics, in my opinion, is what visual design is known for. It's actually the least important aspect when it comes to actually designing software. It really matters if it can be used. If it can't be used, nobody's going to care if it's pretty. So I'm a big like usability trumps aesthetics any day. They feed into each other though, because if it's really, really hard to look at, it also makes it harder to use. It's a balance. All right, so visual design and graphic design. Maybe some of you all are familiar with graphic design. I received flyers in the mail or printouts or had branded t-shirts made, that kind of stuff. Graphic design generally deals with static imagery, and things that get printed. So anything that you're going to be physically like holding generally falls into the category of graphic design. They have a lot of overlap with visual design, but the reality is that visual design for software has a bunch of key aspects that are different than graphic design. So like I said, graphic design is generally static. Static means that like you have basically like, you know what you're designing in. So you make a box and then you fill it with stuff, and that's what your final product is going to be, right? Maybe it gets printed on a t-shirt, so you have to think through like, oh, it's going to get printed, so I have to see how that looks, that kind of stuff. But most of the time, the point is it doesn't change a ton after it gets designed. Whereas visual design, when it comes to software, is difficult because you can't control how people are going to be interacting with your design, right? You might know that they're going to be using a computer, but if they're using a computer, we have what kind of operating system are they using? What kind of browser are they using? What size is their computer? Do they have additional settings on their computer that might change stuff? There's just a bunch of extra pieces. I like to tell people that I dabble in graphic design, but I am not a particularly good graphic designer because I've just spent way too many years thinking about all this other stuff. And I'm like, wait, what do you mean it's not going to move and adjust layouts and all kinds of stuff? Oh, there we go, we're stuck. All right, so I think Max told me he might be using this graphic with you all, but basically who does visual design are people in the sort of top two layers, in the sense of like top being like closest to the user. So dealing with the stuff that's closest to the user. So people who are going to be making the part that you see. So I often tell people when they ask me what I do, I'm like, I design and build software. I do all the part that you use, like that you see and interact with. It's those people. So people who are visual designers, these are like, there's a bunch of names that all are very similar to each other. And then also front-end developers and front-end engineers end up in here as well, because there's like, the reality is that even the best designer is going to forget to include certain interaction pieces. And so front-end developers often end up creating a certain amount of user experience on the fly. So it's all kind of interconnected. So underlying principles of visual design. Anyone have like a super quick question, or should I just breathe and continue?
Nope, no questions.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and if you guys do have questions while I'm talking, I will not be offended if you want to like throw them in the chat or whatever. That's totally fine. Hold on, sorry, I'm fixing my Zoom window. There we go. Now I can see you all. Everyone that's got their cameras on. All right, cool. Basics of visual design. So we have scale, visual hierarchy, balance, contrast, and gestalt, which is a fancy way of saying looking at the whole thing all together. All right, so scale. This is intuitive, but a lot of people don't think about it. So the bigger something is, the more likely you are to see it first. That basically translates into the idea that the bigger something is, the more important it is from a visual standpoint. So it's just something to think about when you're designing some like an application or even your portfolio site. Think about what the most important thing, like basically think about what you want people to see first, and then maybe second and third, and think about scaling those things in a way that's going to make that happen. Just because you want somebody to see something first, second, and third doesn't mean that they have to be different sizes. But if you have like the top 3 things you want somebody to get out of a page, you might want to make sure that they're not like, this big and they have to read the fine print to find them, right? So scale is just, it's thinking about the sizing of things. Visual hierarchy, like I said, it's thinking about order of importance of what's actually located on the page. So like I said, if something is bigger, you want to make sure that that's actually the most important thing and not just like, not that important. You want to make sure you're featuring things that are most important. And like I said here, mostly keep it simple. It's okay to have the vast majority of things on your page sort of in a medium level. And an easy way to figure this out, like from a layout standpoint, is making everything sort of the same. I talk about it in terms of volume, like what pops out to you most, what's the loudest, making everything sort of about the same level, and then look through things, say, okay, this is the most important thing, then make that bigger, right? So make some of the things louder, and make the things that are really not that important smaller, and then that'll kind of help you like create some visual hierarchy. It basically is a way of prioritizing things. You want somebody, if you have a specific action that you want a user to take on a page, you want to make sure that they know that that's what they're supposed to do. Think about it from the standpoint of like, if you're shopping online, there's a call to action button, like an add to cart is always super prominent because that's the most important thing for that company to want you to do most of the time. Balance. So when you stack a whole bunch of things on one part of the page and then leave a ton of white space on the rest of the page, that creates imbalance. So you can have things be symmetrical where they are perfectly matching. You can have them be asymmetrical where they're totally one side. Think about it like a seesaw a lot of times. They can be totally to one side, or they can be collected in one place and kind of spread out. So that's the symmetrical, asymmetrical, or radial idea. But the basic idea is balance has a we naturally see things that are grouped together. We see the whole group, and then we see things that are separated from that group as being super important. So there's a visual piece to balance. If you look for this across things you're interacting with, you'll notice it, like that oftentimes if you have, just as an example, people often will split screen in half, right? They'll have 2 things next to each other and 2 things next to each other. And then the one thing that stretches across those 2 columns seems super important all of a sudden, right? It just broke this balance idea. Contrast. This is another one that's sort of like, having things that are different colors next to each other. That can be colors or it can be light and dark. It's basically just a way that the things sit next to each other. It's how we create boundaries with things without necessarily having to have a line in between them. And contrast gets super important from an accessibility standpoint, because if there's not enough contrast, people who can't see very well have trouble being able to actually see your design. All right, like I said, Gestalt, it's the whole idea of looking at a whole big group of things together. So the image that was like I had for this earlier was basically like a whole bunch of dots, right, that have a cutout on each one and they create a rectangle. Like each of those dots is actually an individual thing, but the negative shape that they create creates a rectangle that we kind of like, our brain thinks, oh, there's a rectangle there, even though there isn't. So just thinking of essentially stepping back from whatever small piece you're working on and looking at how it fits into the whole is the idea of Gestalt. All right, color and typography. So color has tons of stuff to it. We're gonna mostly just talk through a lot of the language around color. Yeah, you can take whole courses in color theory. I'm not going to teach you one tonight. We're already going to go through way too much information as it is. So, all right, so hue. The idea of hue is basically like super saturated color. So it's the color that is it's like the primary colors we teach the kids, right? Like things for children tend to be solid hues. They don't have any kind of variation to them. It's just that very, very bright color at its most vivid, no light or dark variation. And then value refers to essentially lightness and darkness of color. So if the hue would be orange, you would have a very light orange and a very dark orange, right? These matter actually because you can use these in code. So saturation. So we have saturation is basically all the way to the brightest, like the full hue is the full saturation, and then all the way down to gray. So you can actually make any color into gray, and the gray, but the grays as they get closer to gray will be slightly different depending on the color you started with, if that makes sense. So you might have a gray that's more blue, or you might have a gray that's more red, because you started at red. It's essentially bright colors from a visual standpoint. They have bigger visual hierarchy, right? So they're louder, right? They grab your attention. Whereas gray colors tend to be, they feel faded out and they sit back, they're quieter. So that's just one other thing, like visual hierarchy is not just about size, it's also about color and shape. So color formats, like I said, these things get, so the things the pieces we just talked about in terms of color actually translate into code. So color formats on the web, the most common ones you're going to see are hex values, RGB, and HSL. So hex values are those hash codes that you see with, they have 6 characters. Sometimes they only have 3, but generally what it is, so you have, it's 3 pairs of characters next to each other. And those characters go from 0 all the way to FF. Because, you know, ending at 10 or 99 was not enough. So then RGB is a 0 to 255 scale. There's reasoning behind a lot of these, but I honestly don't remember them, why they go to 255. But RGB is 0 to 255, and that's 3 values. So you get to decide red, green, and blue, which of those, like how much of each of those you're mixing in. So you can think about this almost like paint mixing. 0 would be none of that paint, right? Whereas 255 would be like, we're gonna mix in a full third of this paint, right? And then that RGBA value, so both RGB and HSL are digital color formats. Hex existed, I think, pre-digital. So they have alpha options. So that alpha option has to do with opacity. So when you see layouts that are like have things that overlap and kind of you can kind of see through them, that's because they've made those things, they've turned the opacity down. You can basically create transparency between, like, underneath things with opacity. And then hue, saturation, and lightness. That's, so I had value in there. Lightness is another term for value, right? So it's hue. What color are we using? That's hue goes for this format goes 0 to 359 because there's 360 degrees in a circle, right? So this one's actually nice because it's essentially a color wheel. You pick which color you want on the color wheel, and then you can turn how bright you want that color to be up and down on the saturation scale. And then lightness is how light or dark you want it to be. So think like white to black, basically. All right, color palettes. This is relevant for you guys because you're in the process of making a portfolio. And I know Max told me that you all built through like essentially a sample template, and you're working on kind of making it your own, or you're working on something custom, which is also totally great. But one of the ways that you can make something your own in a very easy manner is changing the colors. So my personal suggestion is start a color palette with one primary color that has, so primary color for this palette would be either this one or this one, and then jump down to black with it, and then up to white with it, and then pick a grayscale, and see how far you can get before you start feeling like, yeah, you know, I really wish I could use another color here, because the reality is it gets kind of confusing when you have a lot of different colors flying around. It can be super great, actually, to have like a ton of different colors mixed, but I'll be honest, as a designer, I often screw up complicated scenarios where there's a ton of different colors mixing. It's actually easier to create a simple layout sometimes because you can just take extra, there's like a lot of decisions that go into design. So sticking with one color scale and one grayscale, and then keeping a few extra like alert and like messaging type colors can just simplify the decisions you have to make and make things easier. This is like, if you want to use multiple colors, there's tons of different types of color palettes. But like I said, see how far you can get with one color, and then see how you feel about like adding more in. These are just a couple of color picking tools you can use. Another pro tip, and honestly, this is not cheating, I do it all the time. If you are trying to create, like I said, actually, this is the second point. Ooh, you're trying to create a website, like, or any piece of software, and you have a particular like look and feel you're going for, find other pieces of software, other websites, other like examples that have that look and feel, and use those as inspiration. I'm not telling you to copy them verbatim. I'm saying say, oh, I like how this works. I like this piece that they did here. I'm gonna use like kind of figure out how they did that and use something similar in my project. It's the classic line of art and design of like everyone's constantly being inspired by each other and kind of riffing off of other ideas that people have. People do it in the music industry, they do it in the art industry. It's just kind of like very few people just create out of nothing. It's much easier to start from somewhere. And especially when you're learning, I'm still learning, I still do this. It's just figuring out, all right, this is what I'm kind of going for, and building towards that is just an easy way to create something that you like without having to do all the heavy lifting of starting completely from scratch. All right, typography. Probably the most underrated piece of design that most people are just not aware of. It's essentially like, so the long definition, art and technique of arranging type to make written language legible, readable, and appealing when displayed. Essentially, I think about typography. Typography is the written word what tone of voice is to the spoken word, right? So I think everyone at this point is probably familiar with the concept of writing a message to someone in all caps is the equivalent of screaming, right? Typography is sort of the more subtle version of communicating how something sounds through the way the letters look. So an example is if you have a typeface that has serifs, it often is read as a little bit more like stable and traditional. Think like Times New Roman that everybody's, that's like the default for Word, right? And sans serifs tend to be So like the ones that don't have the serifs are these little flourishes on the ends of the letters. They tend to be read as a little bit more like modern and sleek. But honestly, I've seen typefaces that do both. So quick note on language, typeface is technically the name. So like Times New Roman, Arial is a typeface. When you're styling something, typeface is what you add in the font family rule. Technically a font is the size and weight of that typeface. So if you think about like a typeface is like the family and a font is like the individual children in the family, that's like a whole bunch of variations. That being said, if you start actually correctly using these words in your normal life, people are going to look at you like, typeface? What's a typeface? It's okay. People use font for everything most of the time. All right, choosing these. This is another one that I would argue if you find a website whose font you like, just go figure out what font they're using. You all have talked about Chrome DevTools or DevTools in general at this point. Yeah. So one of the fun things about a lot of styling stuff is if you see something you like, just inspect what you like and see how they're building it, because styling rules are not something that can be hidden. They're not something you can like minify and abstract away. Unlike a lot of the logic code, they're just there. So you can just look at it because they have to be there so the browser can read them. Also, if you want to use an interesting typeface on your portfolio, Google Fonts has tons that are readily available, and you can even serve them up from Google Fonts, which makes things simpler. All right,
Question.
spacing and legibility. Oh, go for it.
So depending on like what type of font it is, one moment. Depending on what type of font it is, can you get in trouble for using somebody else's font?
That's a super good question. Part of the reason I'm pointing you towards Google Fonts is that Google Fonts is a source of like, it's an open source library of fonts. So yes, fonts are definitely licensed. So what you want to do is if you like pull up the website, you look, see, basically the easiest way to do that is just inspect like a paragraph because most places are going to use, they might have different font for their headings and for their body copy of their paragraphs, but a paragraph's a pretty good place to start, or you can just inspect a heading. But when you look at the font family rule, it's going to tell you the name of the font. If you Google, like if you just search for that particular font name, and like basically search for it, if it's paid, it's going to come up in a whole bunch of like services that are trying to sell it to you. Whereas if it's open source, it's going to come up with like a free to use. Here's the whole library, like here's the whole typeface available to download. So it's normally pretty obvious which ones are paid and which ones aren't. You just need to make sure you Google them and double check. It's the best thing that I can say. If they're trying to get you to pay for it, then it's definitely behind a paywall, and you want to make sure that you're not using it without paying for it. Some fonts are actually pretty inexpensive, but there are ones that are very, very expensive. So
thank you.
So spacing and legibility is another one of those things. Did anyone else have to double space papers as a kid to like, so their teachers could like read them and have notes? So the spacing of line, like what's called line height, has a huge effect on how easy it is for people to read stuff. The tricky thing about this is there's not like one hard and fast rule that says like, 16-point font and like 1.5 size line height, like we're perfect, we're great, like in great shape. That's actually a pretty good baseline for most things, but the reality is that you have, depending on your font, the characters, so the actual like size of the letters can be bigger or smaller. So 16-point font in some fonts is like itty bitty and it's difficult to read. In other fonts, you're like, oh boy, I just fit 6 words on the line and now there's like no more space for writing anything. So you just have to it's something you have to think about is sort of how dense the characters are, because it adjusts like something that has like a larger character size is going to need more space in between the lines so that there's more visual room for it to like be read. So just as an example, like this is all the same language. This is like exactly the same words, but these are all different typefaces. So like, for example, this typeface, the characters are really, really large. And so you would need to spread the lines out here a lot more than they are in order for it to actually feel like you can read it. It kind of feels like somebody compressed it into this little box, right? So the rule of thumb that I have here is essentially the larger your font size, the smaller your line height goes. So it's pretty common for, like I said, for default line height for 16-point font, which is like kind of a standard size on the web, to be 1.5. And then as you go up to like title size, where you get to a bigger font size, you might go down to like 1 or 1.25, depending on like your fonts. It's counterintuitive because it seems like, oh, it's a bigger size font actually uses a bigger size of line. But the line height's basically a multiplier. So like when it's larger, it doesn't need to be quite so big. And then I have this last thing here in line length. So anyone else ever had the experience of landing on a website on a fairly large screen and having the text go from one edge of the screen to the other, and you're like reading like this back and forth, which is fine for like, or yeah, all the way up and all the way down. You'd think like, we're so out of shape that going like this and like this is exhausting. But yeah, if you do it over and over again, it is. So the short version is it's actually much better for legibility to keep your line for things that have a lot of text. So think articles, or if you're going to be writing a bunch of stuff about projects you work on, for example, or like, yeah, I mean, articles, like blogs, any kind of thing that where there's a lot of writing that's densely packed, a lot of writing, you want to cap your line length at 40 to 70 characters for anything that's text heavy. So this is kind of an interesting thing because there's a whole thing about like full width layouts for really big screens and all that kind of stuff. For some context, that's awesome. But for when it comes to actually like a lot of type, it's not helpful. Because like I said, it's just, you get exhausted going like this over and over and over again. And conveniently, CSS has a characters measurement. So this little CH in here, you can actually use that. So you can actually say like max width for like something you're working on could be 60 characters. So it'd be 60 CH, and it would automatically cap it at 60 characters. It'll basically break the line 60 characters, which is just convenient. All right. This is a whole bunch of resources. We're not going to go super in depth. These are a couple of tools that if you want to look into like font pairings, you can. They basically are just like the idea of having one font for like your body copy and one font for your headings. Sometimes these are also like dealing with the same font but different sizes. So that's fun too. See, now I'm going back to using fonts instead of typeface. Anyways, another thing in here, if you're interested in typography and want to learn more, my favorite like reading option, like more learning idea for web typography is this book called Better Web Typography. The typography reading link here includes the content from his like little email mini course also, which is, I actually would encourage you to read because it's not very long. It's like 6 or 8 emails. It's like maybe 10 pages of content. But it kind of runs through like the basics, and he's like, the guy who wrote this, I am a big fan of because he's writing specifically about typography intended with the audience of web designers and web developers. So people who are actually dealing in a digital space. And that's kind of unusual. Most typography resources are for people who are like majorly deep into the like art and design world, which most web designers and developers are not. All right. So we just like sped through a whole mini course on visual design and layout, and like basically what you're putting on the page. And now we're going to talk about the page you're putting it on. So responsive page layout. This is a big part of web design because, or frankly, software in general, because as I said earlier, designing for digital is not static, right? People interact with the things we build in a ton of different contexts. So you have stuff like my external monitor is like 32 inches. So it's a huge monitor, right? So I deal with stuff like that. But then you also have stuff where people are, right? They're looking at them on their phones. So there's a huge like difference between that tiny little screen and like this huge screen, right? So we have to think through what the layout does in all of those contexts. It takes a while to kind of get your brain used to thinking like, okay, I can lay things out in this way and it won't break. But it takes a while. So if you're kind of like try laying stuff out, but then expect that when you change sizes, it's probably going to start breaking, and that's fine. The main thing you do is you actually just add more styling to adapt for it. All right, so another way that you make it easier to design for a whole bunch of sizes is starting with the tiny size first. So the tiniest size, it's great to start with mobile phones and like the smallest size first, because it actually forces you to think through specifically what's most important, right? So whenever you're trying to design something or like build something, right? We create what's called scope, where like we say, okay, here's the problem we're trying to solve. Here's all the things we need to do to solve it. Inevitably, there's stuff in there that doesn't necessarily like have to be in there. And so starting in the smallest screen size with like the most limited amount of space available forces you to say, do we really need this? Or is this like a thing that's like, it's nice to have and we can kind of shelve it? Because it forces you basically to like be really hardcore in prioritizing, right? It's like when you live in a really, really small apartment, you got to get real about like what stuff is like actually important in your life versus like, yeah, I got space for that. I'll just chuck it over in the corner. So yeah, it also has a nice advantage of when you style for mobile first, you can actually like create your styling as it's optimized for mobile. And then what you can do is you can actually load additional styles as the screen size gets bigger. If you start by optimizing your styles for desktop, then you add additional styles as your screen size gets smaller, which means that you have the most styles for the device that's least able to handle it, if that makes sense. One strategy for building things mobile first is actually looking at things in responsive view. Hold on, let me exit presentation mode for here for just a second. So I have this open, so we'll just go with it. So I don't know if you guys have found this aspect of the dev tools yet, but you can actually there's responsive mode, there's default like devices in here that the browser will spoof for you, but you can also just use responsive mode, which is nice because it tells you how wide it is. You can actually just move things back and forth. And you automatically know like, the layout's doing something goofy, but it's okay. So it's 192 pixels. Like what's 192 pixels? Maybe I don't care that much, or vice versa. So this is super helpful, but you can, when you're doing your layout in the browser, you could say, hey, I actually want this to be, I think this just zoomed out on me. All right. But basically, you can make it so that you can look at it in different sizes in the browser, which is pretty handy. All right. So page layout, best practices. I will say this, especially when you're starting, follow the conventions. Just super quickly, think through if like nobody told you where to put a menu on a website, where would you put the menu? Like if you close your eyes and you just visualize, right? Like where would it go? Top right, top left? Is that around where we're at? So the reason that that's like immediately what you think of, in the same way that when you open a book, you don't have to think, oh, the spine goes on the left and then I open it, right? You just do it because you've been doing that since you were tiny. There's a bunch of conventions that have built up around websites and around applications. And it's actually a pretty good idea to follow those, especially when you're starting out. Because the essential idea behind user experience design is don't make me think. So you only want people to be thinking about the problem you want them to be thinking about. If they're having to think about where to find your menu, that's probably not the thing you want them to be thinking about at that given moment, right? So putting it in the place that everybody's going to be expecting it to be means that they don't have to think about it. They just think, hey, so I want to go to a different page. Where do I find the menu that'll probably take me to the other page? Oh, it's in the upper left. Click, and then they're on to the next page, right? Whereas if you put it in some goofy spot, they're like looking for it all over the place. They may just get frustrated and not keep using your product. So following conventions, I promise I'm not anti-creativity, but generally speaking, follow conventions unless you have a good reason not to, is my general rule. Another general rule is one call to action per page. It's really easy to be like, this is the most important thing we want people to do. We should put it everywhere, because everywhere they look, it should be like, buy this thing, buy this thing, buy this thing. But the reality is, right, that the more times you have a call to action on the page, the less powerful each individual one is. So the more likelihood like you're going to have where people will just stop seeing them because they're just everywhere, right? The other thing that's super helpful is when you're laying out a website, if you have the content you're going to be putting into a website, use the actual content. If you don't have the content, do your best to spoof what the actual content's going to be like. But whenever possible, use real content. And then the last piece is basically let people know where they are whenever possible. So it's part of the reason things like breadcrumbs have not gone away, because they're sort of useful for like anchoring people, or like if you have to take someone through a multi-step process for some reason, numbering the process, like numbering what process they're on, or like making like a little dot tracker, basically make it super easy for them to know like, hey, I'm on the second to last step, is super helpful. Because if you have no idea where you are in the process, you're just like, all right, how many more of these are there? The more likelihood people are to say, yeah, I'm done. I don't want to keep finishing this thing. This is not worth it. Like if they're not super motivated, they're just gonna be like, no, we're done. All right, things specifically to keep in mind for mobile. Anyone else ever fat fingered anything? I will say I have tiny hands and I still fat finger things. So like all y'all with like enormous hands, I don't even know how you manage. But like, so something super important to remember, it's easy to forget that fingers are really big, right? So like make sure that when you're making things that should be touch points on mobile, like buttons or links or things like that, that they have at least 45 pixels of space to like touch with without clicking on something else. Sounds like super like, yeah, duh, but like when you get into like layout jams where you're trying to fit a bunch of stuff on a really small screen, it gets really easy to be like, well, can't I just stick these two things next to each other? Don't do it. Just don't do it. You'll make your users really grumpy because they're trying to click on something and they're clicking on something else, which everyone has done, and it's so annoying. Other super important thing, think about how you hold your phone, right? It's like fairly normal to hold your phone right-handed and do like use your phone with your thumb. Not the only way people do it, but it's like pretty common. So this goes back to that whole, I just told you to put the menu in the upper left-hand corner, right? Or upper right-hand corner. One of the few times that actually makes sense to break that rule is sometimes it actually makes more sense to put it on the bottom. on mobile, depending on what it is, because you risk people accidentally fat fingering it or putting their hand over it. But for something that is like a lot of actions is going to get used a lot, sometimes it's really important to think about putting it within thumb distance, right? Who knew that you were going to be doing thumb wars tonight? But that's basically the idea. So icons are awesome and pretty, but difficult to communicate with sometimes. So it depends on if you're using a super, super well-known icon. Like at this point, 3 lines is like pretty well known as like a menu. Go for it. But if you're having to like pick an icon and like, oh, this is interesting, maybe I should use this one for this, there's a good possibility that whoever you're picking it for may not make the same leap that you did and may have no idea what that cute button does, which can be a problem because, like I said, you want them to be thinking about what you want them to be thinking and not going, huh, I wonder what that button does. I wonder if it's going to make my phone explode when I decide to click on it. Little things. So another important thing, especially on mobile, it's really tempting to be like, hey, we have all this page content. It's annoying to have to fit it in everything. Let's just collapse it into like an accordion layout and people can just like click and open stuff, which is great, except that like 80% of people won't actually click on anything. And now you just hid all the important things on your page. So if anything is critical, like people have to see it and it's like they have to know about it, don't hide it. Figure out a way to not hide it. The other thing to think about is that when it comes to desktops, fonts should be bigger. When it comes to phones, they can be smaller because I'm not the only person who uses their phone, like right here, right? Not very far from my eyes. Type can be smaller because it's not very far away. All right, large screen best practices. Make sure you cap your page width. And I'm not talking just like characters for reading. In this case, it's actually like, if you just set your page content to be like, let's go 100% and it will just always be full scale, that can be great. But it can also do really weird things. Like if you have a 4-column layout and then you decide it's going to be 100%, and then on my huge monitor, that means that those 4 columns are like each 800 or 900 pixels large. And now I have big grainy images, right? Like it's just one of those things, you just got to think about it. So if you cap the width of your layout for content, basically cap it where your content starts to like struggle and doesn't look good anymore, which is why it's nice to use real content if you can. Keeping the most important things higher on the page as a general rule when it comes to desktops. It's easy to want to cram a lot of stuff because there's a lot of extra space, but keeping things higher up. It's that classic above the fold idea that comes from newspapers, right? Like if it's up, like in the part they're going to see in the first page load, more people are going to see it, right? The same idea of like 80% of your users aren't going to click into the accordions on mobile. 80% of your users aren't going to scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page. So the most important stuff should go where they're going to see it first. And then, like I said, for desktops, make your fonts a little bigger because nobody wants to be doing this all day. You know, besides all the wrinkles and all that kind of fun stuff is just not comfortable. All right, another fun terminology thing, breakpoints. So if you start by optimizing things for really small screens, in the same way that I was talking about that responsive layout, you can basically, once it works on a small screen, you can pull, right? You can make it wider and wider and wider until, hey, all of a sudden my content doesn't look good. That is a breakpoint. It's called a breakpoint because it's the point that your layout breaks. So there are like standard ones for this as a general rule. At this point, you can look up a standard list of breakpoints. I didn't actually include one in here. It kind of varies depending on what project you're working on. The most common one is like basically things that work on like mobile screens, and then you get to like 768 is generally like tablet. And then generally somewhere in the 960 to 1020-ish is like desktops start. But that can be like relevant or not relevant. Like the main thing is like, if you start small and you know you have a layout that works, when you start expanding out, you can figure out where it breaks and then you can adjust your styles accordingly. And I'm assuming you guys probably talked about media queries because I think Max mentioned that you guys did a little bit of like responsiveness with your other layout. So yeah, media queries are your friend. I promise we are almost done. This is the last section, I'm pretty sure. I just want to mention these so you guys know they exist. This is one of those like, hey, come back and look at this later. So once you like feel super comfortable with CSS, there's this really awesome thing called Sass, which is a CSS preprocessor. So that's a mouthful with a lot of S's in it. The basic concept is Sass is sort of like CSS with a lot of extra functionality built in. It allows you to use some basic programming fundamentals inside of CSS. So it lets you use things like called variables. So it lets you store reusable things. So that's great for things like styling systems where you're like, all right, I have my one color, like I have my one primary color, and then I have my, lighter and darker versions of that. And I have my grayscale. And instead of having to like copy and paste that hex code over and over again into different styling things, I can use a variable for that. And then, if I'm like, I was feeling blue yesterday and now I'm like, I gotta go purple. Having to go change that hex code in all the different places you used it is a pain in the butt. Changing it in one place where the variable is defined is so much easier. Anyways, the point is you're going to run into Sass. It'll come up probably when you're starting to do React because it's pretty easy to like add in Sass compiling when you're already compiling React code. But yeah, remember that Sass exists. Don't worry about it for now, but definitely learn it at some point because it's useful. All right, super quick like terminology thing. You're going to hear about design systems at some point in your life, most likely. And then there's also the concept of a styling framework. So a design system is basically like a series of reusable components that make it easier to build large applications and keep track of like, hey, do all the buttons look the same? Do all the links look the same? Are we following the same styling patterns? It sounds simple, but when you get into an application that has like thousands of pages, it's not simple. And then styling frameworks are basically like a code library that has tackled common web design patterns and making them easier to implement. So they're normally something like you just import into your project. Design systems can be, but normally the kind you import into your project are like, well, they're not all internal. We're going to go through a couple of examples. So design systems follow this this concept that is like a guy named Brad Frost, who's kind of a big person in the industry, coined atomic design. So the idea of like you have atoms and molecules and then organisms and things. Basically, you start at the smallest possible and then you build like things build on top of each other. This is another like file it away for future reference. It will become useful when you are tackling React, I promise. And then styling frameworks. Hold on. So we went to design systems. We talked about a little bit about like their small pieces they build together, right? A couple of examples of design systems, material design, which has been converted into a styling framework, a la material UI, Angular material, React material. There's like material design at this point exists in every different framework, every different JavaScript framework that you want. Yes, we ever use the word framework in the tech industry. Apologies. Styling frameworks, basically, like I said, they make it easier to build stuff because there's a whole bunch of pre-built in styles. So a couple of examples of those that are really popular would be Bootstrap, which is a really common styling framework. Tailwind is another really popular one. Materialize CSS is another one that frankly, I'm pretty sure when I made this slide deck, I Googled like material UI styling framework. This is what came up. There's a bunch of different versions of material UI built into styling framework options. Basically, they let you build stuff if you're not interested in like design or custom design, and you're like, I just want to build some stuff and make it work and have it not look too bad, I highly recommend styling frameworks. If you have strong opinions about how things should be laid out and how things should look in like a very like fine-tuned kind of a detailed sort of a way, styling frameworks will drive you nuts. So balance. Styling frameworks are kind of a nice place to start once you kind of wrap your head around a basic page layout and how to style things custom. I actually really recommend styling stuff custom to start with, because it forces you to crash course in how to do stuff. And then once you kind of have a handle on it, then you can use the tools that make it faster. All right. Hey, I'm actually done talking. Well, sort of. This is the link to an articles and resource list and design vocabulary stuff. I made a vocab cheat sheet for you all, and the Better Web Typography mini course stuff. This I put these links as well into today's like syllabus overview sheet that Max sent me. So and also the link to the slide deck that we just went through at like breakneck speed is also in here. So all right. Yeah, so that's actually all I had to cover specifically about visual design. We're gonna do like, I promise no more than 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes on portfolios, and then I will actually let you go do work. Does anyone have questions about visual design stuff before I like switch gears?
No, it seems like a lot.
It is a lot. I apologize, like I said, for the amount of information. This was a lot when I did it in 2 days. I mostly was just like looking at what to cut out, and it's all just really good stuff to have as a reference. So if most of it went over your head, that's totally fine. Just know that you'll be able to look at this later if you like. She mentioned something about like big things and small things. You can just like look.
I will say, I will add, depending on the, like, if you get a job in tech, depending on what your job is, you don't necessarily have to use this in your day-to-day, but it is extremely helpful to know like the basic principles and things like that, because it will help you, like if you're a front-end dev or even a back-end dev, sometimes it helps you really get an understanding of like why things are laid out the way they are and how they're supposed to function. Even if it's not your job to figure that out, it's really helpful for your job. So don't feel like you have to master all of this stuff, but it is like, I don't know, this has always piqued my interest. I know it's very interesting and it's a lot of information, but definitely take it in bits and pieces as you go through the program. And a lot of it will start to sink in as you do more development and you look at more stuff throughout the program. You'll start to see a lot of the patterns that Christy was talking about.
Yeah, no, I apologize for dropping like all this information on you, but it really is like, I wanted you to have it there for reference as much as anything. Yeah, because like I said, depending on what kind of, or like Taylor just said, depending on what kind of job you get, a lot of this stuff is not super relevant, but you may end up like working, right, in partnership with other people at your company for whom this is their whole job, right? So it can be really helpful to like, just in terms of communication, right, across disciplines, for you to have like just sort of a reference point for like, hey, this thing that's really annoying for me to build, like there's actually a reason for it to be this way. Versus like, you know, this person just made this a huge challenge for me because they just don't think I know what I can, like what I'm doing, right? Hey, both thoughts I've had at different points in projects.
I'm laughing
like,
about one website project in particular that drove me nuts sometimes, but turned out to be a really good thing. So
yeah, so it's one of those things. This is it's a slightly outside of a developer's wheelhouse, but it's a useful thing to have a reference for. Because shoot, at some point you might be teaching this class and needing to help other people understand how to lay out pages and websites. So yeah. All right. Super quickly. Oh, unless anyone has more questions. I don't want to like.
I think we're good.
Okay. We are going to jump to doing breakout rooms really quickly, but I wanted to talk to you guys very speedily about portfolio development and specifically the process that I went through, just because, not because I'm some kind of like perfect example of how to build a portfolio, but because I literally just did this for like, as Max said, the stars aligned and you're doing in real life what we're having the students do in class. So this is a thing, and part of the reason I wanted to like tell you guys about this process is, so I've been a dev now for 8 years, right? I think this is the third or fourth time I built my portfolio. So this is a thing that you end up doing most likely every year or two, because you learn more and it just happens. Life stuff gets in the way. But when it comes to portfolios, I will make two very key arguments. The first one is you need to have a portfolio. So like, you're a person that works in the tech industry. So like the things that people are going to look at when they are trying to consider if you should, like, they should hire you for a job is your resume and your work examples. So your portfolio doesn't necessarily have to be a custom built website, but you need work examples to show to people, because this is very much an industry that says, prove to me what you know how to do, which is awesome. It's part of why you can get a job in this industry without having like a computer science degree. But it also means you have to actually have things to show, right? So you have to have a portfolio or work examples of some sort or another. And then the second thing that I want to emphasize is this is, the portfolio is not the end all be all of your skills. So it doesn't have to be the most beautiful, most amazing, most everything thing that you've ever built. For me, building portfolios brings out like all of my like unfortunate perfectionist tendencies, which means that they can be like incredibly paralyzing for me because I'm just like, it's not perfect. Do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Is a phrase I use a lot recently. I have a toddler, so this is a phrase I use a lot. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just needs to work. Because the whole point of it, right, is to say, hey, this is me, this is something I know how to do. You want people to be focused on your work examples, not on like, it doesn't have to be the most beautiful thing ever. The other thing I will say is that it's okay to use a template. If you're not a person who has aspirations for a job related to design, whether that's front end development or design technology, or yeah, frankly, like basically most of the things that like actually deal with design on a regular basis in your job. If you're not a person who wants a job that is related to design, if that whole presentation I just gave is like, yeah, I'm gonna let other people deal with that stuff, I'm good. Don't stress about what your portfolio, like, don't stress about making like your portfolio this like super custom perfect thing. For you, the point of a portfolio is a collection of links so people can see all of your work. So that means that, you know, it's linking to your GitHub so they can see like projects you've built, or it's linking to your CodePen so they can see other projects you built, which CodePen is a little more front end, but you get the idea. Like, it's a collection place for you to talk about projects you've done. So it could even be examples of like, hey, you know, I set up such and such database using such and such structures, you know, and for a chance for you to write down your thought processes about why you did what you did and how you did it. It's just like, think about it sort of like your digital address, in the sense of like, they need to know where to send your paycheck, and they also need to know like that you exist, and having a digital address is a part of how to let them know that you exist. So after all my spiels about making sure you use real content, I'm about to show you the current state of my portfolio, which is using not real content. Because like I said about the whole perfectionist thing, I finally got my portfolio today to the place where I'm ready to start adding the content in. But I decided if I took the time to write the content before I did the portfolio, you and I would be having a conversation like 6 weeks from now. So caveat. But anyways, also portfolios do not have to be complicated. They can be super simple. So basic things happening in my portfolio, simple navigation. I literally only have 3, well, technically there's going to be work pages, but like it's basically 3 pieces of nav and a homepage icon, super quick blurb about me, featured selected work. Yes, I have so many ridiculous pictures in my life. We did a project regarding NFTs and I had to come up with sample photos for everything. But yeah, so this is literally, it's a blurb, grid with cards, footer, link to my LinkedIn, link to my GitHub. Note on content, be selective about what social media you link to. Like it's a good idea to link to your LinkedIn, but like you don't, even for GitHub, like it's nice to show that you have a GitHub presence, but like if you don't have much of a like, okay, actually you guys are brand new, put your GitHub on there. It's a balance depending as you get more senior. There's like a, do you want to put your GitHub on there if it's not impressive balance? I have that problem because mine's not that impressive. And the other thing I will say is do take the time to test your portfolio. Have friends and family look at it once you kind of get it more where it's at, because you do weird stuff. Like I looked at this on a humongous screen and realized that the angle like broke at like a super wide screen at one point because I had the like angle off slightly, you know, silly thing. It's also totally okay to use placeholders while you're working on it. So this is actually my local copy of my portfolio. This is what my portfolio looks like in public right now. So you can, it's okay to, I guess what I'm trying to say is it doesn't have to be perfectly done in order for it to exist, right? The point is to hang your shingle out. So it's okay to say stuff like, hey, it's under construction. I looked at the portfolio of one of my colleagues recently, and his portfolio has under construction things all over it. I was like, did I look at your portfolio before we hired you? What's going on here? It's good to finish stuff before you start looking for a job, but if it needs to be under construction for the moment, that's totally fine. The other thing I'll say, oh, that's the version I want, is that if you're going to use sample content that actually fits the breadth of what you're going to be doing. So I made sample content in here that has tons of different titles that I would actually, like title sizes I would actually be using. It has paragraphs of text. Yes, you are seeing meat words. This is my favorite lorem ipsum generator is a bacon ipsum generator. So it uses like a million different meat versions, which I just think is funny. Added things like block quotes and code snippets and images, basically the kind of real things that you would actually have in your content so that when you're building, you'll know if those things will break your layout. Just as an example. If you all want me to, I'm happy to include a list of like, here's the different things I included. Because a lot of the stuff, things to include is second nature because I've done it a bunch of times. But
yes, please, that would help.
yeah, I will, I'll add that in Slack. All right, so that's essentially all I had about, that's enough about my portfolio, which I wish actually included Pi. That would be wonderful. But unfortunately it does not. So
can I ask how you chose your fonts for your portfolio?
Yeah. So I actually used, I think it was Font Pair. Yeah, this is it. Basically to just like, I find when it comes to typography, easier to look at other things that like already exist versus just looking at the font and going like, huh, I wonder how that's going to be. Um, so I used like these pairings, looked at ones that I was like, oh, I kind of like, I find this one interesting, or like I find this one interesting. And I went through, looked at a bunch of different ones, and basically said, okay, here's two combinations I like. And then I started building my website and I tried those combinations out and saw like decided which ones worked. And I was actually also redesigning my resume at the same time. So I actually used the same font for my resume. um, that's this is one of those things where my job is very much design heavy. If I wasn't a design heavy person, like in my professional life, I wouldn't stress about like custom fonts and all kinds of stuff. There's a bunch of really like popular ones that are like pretty simple and like middle of the road. Things like Open Sans, Bravato's another one. It's actually on here. That's a pretty common one. But this page, I like this page, and I included a link to this in, I think it's in those slides for sure. But fontpair.co is pretty easy to remember also. That just has like, it has a whole bunch of different examples. Rubik is another common one that's pretty clean. I actually spent about a year working on an app that was all Rubik. But yeah, I mean, there's just a ton. There's so many different fonts in the world. So it's one of those like looking at different examples. And the nice thing I like about this website is these headings are actually using, so these headings and paragraphs are actually using the font combinations, and you can actually change them if you want to. So like something that I did was go through and see how my name looked in the title text. This sounds super self-centered, but when you consider that your name is going to be in large type on your website, most likely, if you really don't like the way that certain of the characters look in your name, it's probably not a good choice. Other super tiny pro tip, if you don't have a logo for yourself, because most people in the world don't have their own like neatly branded logo, you don't need to create some kind of crazy logo. If you want to pick a fun font that is kind of like fits your style and just use your initials, that's a super common way to do things. And it can like, it looks like a custom design logo with like, it's very, very simple. And you can do that in something like Canva, or you can do it in Photoshop, or like, or honestly, you could even probably, I didn't do this, this is actually an SVG, but like you could even just actually use the letters and style them. If it's a font you're pulling into your website anyways, you could even just use the letters and style them with the font. You do risk the possibility of, if that font doesn't load for some reason, then it wouldn't look as nice, but that's life. That was a long answer to a simple question, but
No, thank you. That helped.
anybody else have questions before we jump to breakout rooms and stuff? Nope. All right, I'm seeing shaking heads, so I'm gonna make the assumption that that covers everybody.
So I don't know, how do we want to do breakout rooms, Christy? I have a list of students who turned in their assignment. I think we can have them go first since they had something turned in that's like tangible. And then how long do you want to make each little like one-on-one?
Hold on, counting.
And I guess also it's 7 o'clock. So if people are, I don't know if we want to take a quick 15-minute break or 20-minute break, or if you want to do breakout rooms, and if you're not in a breakout room, you can go ahead and take a break. We can have like a list of students who are going to go now. And then if you're not one of those students, then you can take your break.
I'm gonna take my break.
Okay.
Even though like when everybody does figure out what they want to do, Caitlin, can you help me like build my code up a little bit more? Because I plan on going last in the breakout
Yes.
room.
Yes.
Thank you.
I can go now.
Yeah.
Is the
Okay.
breakout, what's
Yeah,
the break? What is the breakout room for? Are we,
Basically 5 or 10 minutes to talk to me.
okay, did they schedule times for that? Because I feel like I'm missing something. 'Cause, like half the class is in the breakout room, but it seems like everyone's here. Are we just scheduling or how are you doing that?
Yep. So we didn't start the breakout rooms yet, Shanjay. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna start them soon. It's just gonna be a one-on-one with Christy talking about the design for your portfolio site. So it's gonna be super simple. It's basically the homework assignment from last night. But if you didn't turn it in, it's fine. You can still do the breakout room and talk about your portfolio and like how you want to design that. But it's just gonna be like 5-10 minutes each. Nothing crazy.
Okay, yeah, because I'm like, okay, all right. Thank
Yeah,
you.
no, you're good. You're not missing anything.
I love your plants. But anyway.
Thank you. I have many plants in here. It feels like a jungle. Okay, so Christy, you want to go first? And then we'll pick 2 people and then everybody else can go on break for 20 minutes because it'll be like about, I don't know, 5-10 minutes. And then when you're done with Christy, then you can go on a break as well. Yeah.
Okay.
And Christy also deserves a break at some point, but.
Sorry, that's what I was gonna say.
It's okay. I'll survive.
All right. So I'm going to put you in the breakout room and then who wants to go after Christy, student Christy? I have 2 Christy.
I
All
can
week
go.
I've been hearing Christy, and it's been making, every time he says my name, I think I'm like, what?
I want to show you something on my code first before I like go into the.
That's okay.
15.
If you handed in your homework and you want
I
to go
did
after,
it and it's completed, but I didn't get to submit it last night. I was at work.
that's okay. Anybody want to volunteer? Just so we have like a next.
I could go.
Okay, so it'll be Christy and then Doug, and then we'll figure out what's after that. Everybody else, if you'd like to take a break, feel free. If not, you can keep working on your site and I'll be here as well.
And I
Alright,
promise I'm friendly and
so-
not judgmental. I promise that I'm not going to be judging you. Don't worry. This is for
Okay.
feedback, not for like judgment.
No problem.
All right, so we have Christy and Christy. Fun.
Can you stop the recording?
Yeah, I can stop it. Who asked for that? Sorry.
Nicole.
Oh, yep. Yeah, if you guys, that's fine.